Welcome to our special program this evening. I am NAMI Finger Lakes Executive Director Beth McGee. September is Suicide Awareness Month, and our theme tonight is One Conversation Can Save a Life. Please note that we'll be discussing the difficult topic of suicide and childhood sexual abuse this evening. We'll be discussing these things from many perspectives, so I would like you to take a moment to consider your personal safety and sensitivity, and feel free to leave the event at any time if it becomes uncomfortable for you. This event will be recorded and available to view next week on the NAMI Finger Lakes YouTube channel. For our guests, this is a safe place to share. Please be mindful of your fellow panelists and audience when sharing about suicide or a suicide attempt. We ask that you not share details about the means, location, or method of suicide. Instead, we want to know about how it has impacted your life and what feelings you have about it now. We'll begin with a brief presentation about our local suicide prevention and crisis services, then move into discussion with our guest advocates, and then learn from our representative from NAMI New York State about the 988 crisis response system to be implemented in summer of 2022, and more about Nicole's Law and the Nicole Ettere Remembrance Garden. Before we end this evening, we'll have an opportunity for questions from attendees. And please hold your questions until that time and then submit them in the chat feature. So tonight our guests are Beth Harrington from the Suicide Prevention Crisis Services. I'll give more of an introduction in a few minutes for Beth. And our guest advocates are Larry Albro, Jason Hungerford, and Roy Ettere. Matthew Shapiro is here from NAMI New York State, and we'll be learning from about our advocacy efforts and information about what we can do to help advocate for the changes that are coming up with regard to suicide and crisis prevention. Okay, so to start our conversation this evening, I'd like to introduce Beth Harrington. Beth worked as an RN at Cayuga Medical Center for 31 years, followed by a second career in emergency management with Tompkins County. She served as a paramedic and is now acting executive director for suicide prevention and crisis services in Tompkins County. Welcome, Beth, and thank you for being here with all of us and for many of all the ways that you advocate for the people in our community. I'd like to have you start us off this evening with your presentation about the services available locally for people in crisis. So would you like to go ahead and start sharing your screen?
Thank you, Beth. I really appreciate being here and also learning from everyone else. So let me see if this share screen works. Did that work?
It did. Now we just need to see a PowerPoint. There we go. Perfect.
So I am just going to do kind of a brief introduction to local services and start off with some facts about suicide. There are all kinds of statistics out there. I do want to emphasize, and probably throughout, is suicide is preventable, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about this evening. The two largest risk populations are middle-aged men, and then any seniors greater than the age of 85. But we can identify many other populations who are also at greater risk for death by suicide, and that can be veterans, LGBTQ+, first responders, people of color. Almost any category of people do have some risk factors. Almost 48,000 Americans die each year by suicide, but in 2019, 2020, there was a slight decrease in those numbers, but not by much. 10th leading cause of death overall. 130 people die by suicide each day. but even more, it's the second leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 10 and 34. And I can tell you the calls to the crisis line, we're seeing an increase of calls from much younger members of the community. 1.38 million attempts each year, and it affects everyone. But more than that, one death by suicide, it's thought to impact another 135 people. So it's not an isolated event. Our beginnings go back to 1969. There was suicide deaths in colleges. In 1968, the community rallied around that, and Chaplain Jack Lewis of Cornell University headed up a community initiative to start the crisis line. Initially, it was an all-volunteer agency. We still have volunteers, but we do have some paid staff. The first year, a little less than 400 calls were received. Almost 6,000 last year, and we're going to be more than that this 2021. We started out with a local number, which you can see on the screen, and then several years ago we became part of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and that national number 1-800-273-TALK. Our hours of operation are 10 a.m. to 1 a.m., but we're the availability of talking to a crisis line counselor is available 24/7 because after we close down at 1, all calls are routed to a call center in Syracuse. And to be part of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, we do have to be accredited, and we are the American Association of Suicidology. Some of our services, our main one, of course, is crisis line counseling. And our counselors are trained and practice active listening, non-judgmental. They are taught to listen for validation of what the caller is feeling, to help the caller start to define some areas that might be self-help for them. We do have information on potential resources that they might need, and we are more and more doing follow-up calls. Community education on suicide prevention awareness, doing forums like this, and we're helping people in finding bereavement and grief support resources. Our crisis line counselors, whether they're paid or volunteer, go through a pretty extensive training program. We do practice active listening. We're not therapists, we're not psychologists, but there is a method for our crisis line counseling. All calls are basically anonymous. We really focus on the callers and their stories by reflecting back what they're feeling and validating their emotional pain. We help the caller clarify reasons for dying and then the reasons for living. And what we're found is that the reasons for living start to outweigh those reasons for dying. We guide them towards identification of self-help activities, and then that follow-through call. And what we've also noticed, about 40% of our callers are what we call familiar callers. And these are people that are regularly in touch with the crisis line, and it is one of their self-help activities to maintain that connection. Suicide is really a complex problem. There's no real one single factor that we could identify and say, well, if we eliminated that, we can eliminate suicide. But you can see here on the screen, there's four kind of key thoughts about it. They're not everything, but they're really important that we found that probably are consistent across the board. Social isolation, and certainly the pandemic really emphasized that, not only in people that were marginally isolated to begin with, but other populations such as school children not being socializing in school. That's a loss of connectivity. Basically, when individuals don't have what they need to help manage their stress, their social needs, and other needs that they might have in their life. Loneliness or hopelessness certainly speaks for itself. And we also found that people with a loss of purpose or a lack of self-worth, again, are at risk. There's numbers out there, and the statistics really, really vary on how many people have the mental health disorders. It can go anywhere. I've seen 20% up to 90% of our callers have those problems. Substance use is one of those. It may be a problem unto itself, or it may be in conjunction with other mental health disorders. Certainly, and we've seen this increasingly over the last couple of years, prejudice and discrimination, or family rejection, bullying, violence, childhood trauma, those types of things. Stressors that challenge traditional roles, and that kind of ties in with a high suicide rate in middle-aged men. These are people that they may have lost their job or things like that, and they can't provide for their family. Chronic diseases or illness, or a lack of access to mental health or medical care. There's many other factors, but these kind of rise to the surface again and again. Red flags or warning signs, and this is kind of what this is all about, is being able to recognize these warning signs or red flags and then intervening. Anybody experiencing recent loss or grieving, especially in older people, it may seem disproportionate to the loss. But if you think about the elderly, they may have lost spouses or partners of, 50, 60, 70 years. So that really can set them up for thinking about suicide. People often make statements that they are feeling like a burden, or that others around them would be better off without them. We may see behavior where they start giving away prized possessions. We can see changes in behavior, sleep patterns, sleeping too much or not enough, moodiness, loss of interest in usual enjoyment, or they may have problems just performing daily activities. We see people engaging in risky behavior, such as unprotected sex, drinking excessively, substance use, that type of thing. A previous suicide attempt is considered a risk factor, or sometimes even just knowing someone who died by suicide, especially if they were a close family member or friend. These are all cries for help. Suicide prevention is really everybody's responsibility, and the big thing is ask the question. If you notice some of those red flags or warning signs in people around you, point blank ask them, are you thinking of killing yourself? You need to be candid. You have to be concerned, and you really have to be direct about those concerns. In asking that, you are actually validating their feelings of desperation. There's a myth out there, if you ask somebody this question, you're planting the seed of thinking about death by suicide. That is not true. But you are opening a dialogue for them to talk through whatever their emotional pain is, and be direct. Again, don't frame it. You aren't thinking about killing yourself, are you? You need to be direct. Are you thinking of killing yourself? If the person responds yes, and again, a lot of times this is an opening for them. It gives them an option for start discussing and talking about that pain and trying to deal with it in another way besides death by suicide. You need to really just listen. Stay with them. You're going to establish that caring connectivity. You should know what resources are in your community. Sometimes you may even need to accompany them to those resources, especially if it's a serious risk or an imminent danger. You may be the one to take them to the emergency room or have them call the crisis line. And then follow up, maintaining that concern, maintaining that connectivity is really, really critical. There's a lot of studies out there nowadays about the value of follow-up. Some takeaways. I really want to emphasize the crisis line is open to everyone. And you don't have to be in a crisis to call. Sometimes you're just really stressed out and you just need to vent. You just need to work it out, and you just need somebody to listen. They're not going to judge you. You're anonymous, but they're there just to listen. Sometimes this helps to actually prevent a crisis by just talking before it gets to that point. And every crisis is individualized. Whatever that caller is telling you or the person that's talking to you, that is real to them. And they have to be acknowledged as having those real feelings. So you be the one who asks the question and actually saves the life. You can also learn more about suicide and prevention efforts in your community. Get involved. There's a lot of different efforts going on in our community. We do have a suicide prevention coalition. There's a zero suicide framework that was adopted actually by the county legislative body about 4 years ago. There's always educational opportunities locally and online. And there's other activities. We just, the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention just sponsored an Out of Darkness walk. There was Chalk Your Walk efforts, a lot of activities associated with September. I put resources in here, but if anybody needs more resources, they can always contact me or call our office, and we'll be glad to help you either find something or direct you to somebody else that can help. So in closing, we're really talking helps reduce that stigma associated with suicide and mental health. You need to be an active listener and a caring person, and be an advocate for better mental health laws and resources.
Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciated that. I had a couple of thoughts I wanted to, just based on what we've talked about in the past about the services. And one is that about a quarter of your calls are actually family members or friends who have a loved one or a friend who is experiencing crisis, and they're concerned about them. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a fairly good description. We call them third-party callers, but it's someone else calling concerned about another person. So yes.
Okay. Yes. And people don't have to be suicidal to call.
Oh, yes, I want to stress that. We really would like people to call before they get to that point, so that they can talk out and come to some solutions besides thinking about death by suicide. Yes, it's a critical point.
Yes, thank you. I know that I personally have reached out to the line before about someone I've been concerned about. My experience has been that the person is a very active listener and kind of helps me sort out my thoughts and my experience in the moment. They are not there to problem solve for me, but they can help me kind of figure out for myself what next steps would be, or if I feel like it needs to jump to a higher level of response. I also wanted to talk about this is how we access mobile crisis here. Unless there's an imminent threat and you feel like the person is immediately in danger, and then of course calling 911 is necessary. But mobile crisis response is also reached through the crisis line?
Yeah, in Tompkins County, yes. You can request the mobile crisis team if you're already a client of the mental health clinic, or if you just need that kind of almost immediate intervention, you can call, and then we will call the on-call person for the mobile crisis team. We'll have a discussion with them and figure out what is the best approach to help this person. And I should say that we always try to encourage the caller, or even the third-party caller, to take your own initiative, whatever it might be. But about 1% of the calls or something, people are at literally at immediate risk. And so we may then have to call 911 or call the mobile crisis team. But usually we can encourage people to do that, empower them to do that on their own, to take their own steps for that solution.
Okay. And in my experience, if mobile crisis does seem like the reasonable option, then mobile crisis will be connected and then they will call you back. So they'll call us back, the family member who's concerned, if that's necessary.
Right. The mobile crisis team has up to an hour to answer a request or respond. And they will try to do that by telephone first and have a discussion with whoever the caller is about what's going on. And then they will make a decision whether they actually need to physically go to be with that caller or not. And that is their decision. Usually they will call us back and tell us the follow-up. And we may even schedule follow-up calls then with the caller's permission to see where that went.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else before we move on that you think we haven't talked about that you think is important?
No, I think just asking that hard question. It's a difficult, very uncomfortable question, and it's not a question society grew up thinking it was normal to ask. So that's all part of that stigma around suicide, around mental health issues.
Thank you. And the figure that you shared, 135 people being impacted by each individual suicide. And at NAMI, we always quote 1 in 5 people experience a mental illness, and 5 in 5 people are impacted by it, whether it be your brother or your sister or child or partner or husband or wife, coworker, fellow student. These things impact us in ways that make it really necessary for us to have this conversation openly so we can help support one another. So I really appreciated that information. So I also want to take a moment to make note that this is not a diverse panel. And cultural differences can really limit a person's willingness to participate or to share about these experiences, or even to gain access to mental health or crisis services, because calling for help has sometimes been dangerous for people in the BIPOC community. So embracing this as a solution during a time of need isn't really something that comes very easily. So I just want to make note of that this is a population that is not represented in this conversation here tonight. I do want to note, though, that the statistic that men in middle age are most likely to die by suicide, or the highest rate of people who die by suicide. And our panel of people who are sharing experience tonight is all men. I won't suggest you're all men of middle age, but you are all men. And so this is an important thing to note in modeling conversation. Men tend to not be willing to be so vulnerable in conversations like this. And this is a really important way to show how that can be done safely and how important it really, really is. So I appreciated that information as well. Okay, so next I would like to, and I'm going to ask you all to unmute yourselves as we open up your conversation. You're part of the conversation because I am not able to unmute you individually for some reason. So I'd like to introduce our advocates. We have a peer advocate and 2 family members that suicide has impacted. First is Larry Albro. Larry is a peer advocate with the Mental Health Association in Tompkins County. A survivor of childhood sexual abuse, Larry lives with complex PTSD and bipolar disorder and has faced many challenges that he's had to overcome as a result. And we're going to learn from Larry about a time in which he considered dying by suicide. Jason Hungerford is a volunteer facilitator with NAMI Finger Lakes Partner Spouse Support Group. His husband, Jason, of 19 years, died by suicide in 2017. Jason is active in the Ithaca community, focusing on advocacy work related to cancer, mental health, and LGBT issues. Roy Ettere is a family advocate for NAMI New York State. Roy and Lucille Ettere lost their daughter, Nicole, to suicide after multiple hospitalizations for previous attempts and releases from the hospitalizations without adequate discharge plans. Roy and Lucille shared their story in a New York Senate hearing on suicide. And as a result of that testimony, a bill has been introduced to the Senate that would provide additional help and better access to resources for those who have multiple episodes of self-inflicted, life-threatening injuries and for their families and caregivers. Our final guest, Matthew Shapiro, is the Associate Director of Public Affairs for NAMI New York State. He was asked to write the law and to ensure that it meets the needs of our community. And while the law has been written, it still needs to be passed by both bodies of the legislature. And we'll hear more from Matthew about Nicole's law and the 988 crisis implementation, as well as the Nicole Ettere Remembrance Garden. And Roy, also, when you share with us, I'd love to hear your experience with about the garden as well. So please feel free, and Matthew can just follow up if he has additional information to share. So Larry, if you don't mind, could we please start with you this evening? What would you like us to know about you before you considered suicide? And if you...
First of all, thank you for having me be a part of the forum.
Sure.
Very honored. I am a survivor of 7 years of child sexual abuse. And I say that because my mental health didn't fail until I was in my mid-40s, when I had a 17-year career at Cornell University. And my mental health began to fail. And I had no idea what was wrong with me or what was happening. And I had to leave Cornell because of mental health issues. I could no longer do my job responsibly. And I found myself in the job market taking positions that were ever decreasing in responsibility level because my brain just wouldn't allow me to work at the level that I used to. And again, I really had no idea what was going on with me. My family saw me declining and blamed it on several things, but were not aware of the abuse at the time. I called suicide and crisis prevention several several times. I can't remember how many. Because I was feeling terrible and I didn't know why. And I didn't even want to tell them that I was a survivor. I wasn't ready to admit it. Until one night I called and I was in really rough shape. And I started to cry and I started talking about harm. And the very skilled operator said, "Do you want to hurt yourself?" And I said, "I don't know." And at that point, because of the ideation leading up to the phone call, and because of the way I was feeling, we agreed that I should go to the hospital. So I was lucky that we have a behavioral services unit here at Tompkins, or Cayuga Medical Center rather. And I was admitted to the unit for a 72-hour period. In that time, I met a psychiatrist who sat down with me and explained for the first time ever that I had complex post-traumatic stress disorder along with bipolar disorder. She also reminded me or informed me that I had right to advocacy. I had right to tap into the criminal justice system and tell my story, talk to law enforcement, and report what had happened to me so many years ago. When I got out of the hospital, I was referred to the Advocacy Center of Tompkins County, who handles sexual abuse complaints along with physical and sexual adult domestic issues. And after working with them for a long time, I would say probably a year, they were trying to convince me that I should self-report and that I should go to law enforcement. Unfortunately for me, it was complicated because my perpetrator was a law enforcement official and very well known in the county. And I was petrified of what it would do to my family, of what it could do to me, of my safety. But through the Advocacy Center and through the work I did with them, I finally reached out to law enforcement and worked with the district attorney's office and several law enforcement agencies to give my statement, to give my depositions, to give my sworn statements, and really fell apart. Excuse me. Excuse me again. That was a very difficult time in my life. And one of the problems is my family had turned against me once I disclosed because of the embarrassment and the stigma. Not only that I had been sexually abused, but that I had mental health problems. I was homeless for 6 weeks. And eventually I got back into the family and was staying with my mother, who announced to me one morning that she didn't believe my story. She didn't believe that I was sexually abused. She didn't think there was anything wrong with me. And the lack of validation and the hurt that I felt from my own mother not believing me flipped some kind of a switch. I hadn't had any ideations. Through all of this, I had not thought about hurting myself until that moment that my mother said, "I don't believe you." She had no idea how ill I was. I drove about 4 hours away with a plan to commit suicide. I had a method. I had the resources, and I was convinced that this was the best decision for my world and the universe if I wasn't here anymore. That I had done my duty, I reported, I gave a chance for other victims to come out and tell their story. And it was time for me to go. Luckily, law enforcement, somebody notified law enforcement in the area that I was in and the way that I was acting. And I was taken by law enforcement to a psychiatric hospital in the city that I was in. And there I was heavily medicated, taken down. I became very violent. I was taken down by a mental health takedown team, which was very, very traumatic. And given a lot of medication, and basically I slept for 3 days and they released me. I went from there, reached out for mental health resources, made some very good friends at the Mental Health Association, continued calling the suicide and crisis prevention line for extra support. Could no longer work because of my mental health and the medication that I was taking. So I had to go on disability, which has its own stigma. My family basically walked away. And that wasn't helping anything. The difference between the first attempt and the second attempt was one had ideation and the other one was like somebody flipped a light switch. I had no warning. I had no opportunity to tell anybody. My brain went into a psychotic break and I didn't want to talk to anybody. I was convinced about what I was going to do. And nobody really could have helped me at that point except law enforcement. Today, I'm much healthier thanks to a lot of medication and a lot of very, very good treatment. And I'm able to return to work, and I do work as a peer advocate, telling some of my life story to help others. I always remind people that I'm one of the lucky ones because I survived. And that is my story in a nutshell.
Thank you, Larry. That's very difficult to share, I know, and very difficult for all of us to hear. When we're hoping to nurture relationships where we're supportive of one another and supportive of people who are experiencing times of despair. This is a hard example of how you did not have those supports that you needed at that time. Okay, thank you. Jason, would you like to share with us now and share a little bit about your husband, Jason, and what you'd like us to know about Jason?
Sure. And I apologize in advance for the confusion. Yes, we were both named Jason. His name was Jason Seymour, and he worked at Cornell University, and he was a bigger than life personality, instantly likable by anyone who met him, well liked by friends and colleagues, and was interested in technology and astrology, and was active in the community. And he was my partner for half my life. And he dealt with anxiety for much of his life, but it didn't really become that big of a problem until I would say maybe 2013, and it started to affect his work. He also went on disability for mental health, and we were constantly searching for something that would help. And some way to fix him. And it just seemed like as more time went on and the more resources that we put on the situation, the worse he got. And he got to a point where he just felt like he wasn't living his own life. He had literally become a shell of a person that he once was. And after, I don't know how long he really considered suicide. But he did take his life in November of 2017. And I can't say it was a total shock. I think that the timing of it was surprising for me, because I had actually noticed some improvement within the 2 weeks prior. And I've since learned that that's often the case for people who plan their suicide ahead of time. They feel a sense of relief once they've set a date and put the plan in motion. And I believe that was the case in his situation. Unfortunately, it also coincided with a medication change. So what I thought was improvement, I accredited to the medication. And but in reality, it was, in fact, that he had set a date and he was preparing for the last couple of weeks of his life. Since then, I've gotten involved with different organizations focused on suicide prevention and suicide loss. During the probably maybe for a year or year and a half after his death, I did seek out services from Ethica Suicide Prevention and Crisis, and met with the support group there, and then met one-on-one with a grief counselor. That was in addition to my own therapist. I felt like seeing someone who specialized in suicide loss was a benefit to me, as well as just my normal therapist. I also sought out a spousal loss support group through Hospicare. So combined, all of those things were really critical. The family-to-family class that I took through NAMI was hugely beneficial for me. I took it while he was still living, and I say that it provided the last year or so of his life. I was able to manage things a lot better. I think I had a lot more empathy toward what he was going through, a lot better understanding. We communicated better. All of those positive things I definitely would not have had if I had not taken the NAMI course. And I really credit the NAMI course for preparing me for that day that I found him. And many people who, many suicide survivors feel an incredible sense of guilt, or think to themselves, what could I have done to save this person? And I think, fortunately, in my case, I didn't have any of those feelings. I knew for sure that we had done all that we could do. And there wasn't an easy solution. And I don't think he wanted to die. I think he just wanted to quiet his brain. And he had tried everything else, and he felt like he wasn't really living his life. And so he took the route of suicide. I miss him very much. I think about him every single day. It's been a big loss.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for sharing that experience. I've heard it mentioned that from other people who have lost a loved one that, like you had said, people don't want to die. They don't want to suffer. And it's kind of a tragedy that we have not gotten to a place where we have everything we need to end that sort of suffering in order to mitigate that. So thank you for sharing that with us. Roy, would you like to share with us?
Thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I lost my daughter November 17th. I'm sorry, November 19th, 2017, to suicide. I want to start off by telling Larry that I heard everything while I was trying to get on my computer, and my heart goes out to you. I'm so sorry you had to go through that and deal with that. I don't know how I could even think or deal with that the way you did, as well as you did. And I admire you for that. It had to be a tremendously hard struggle. And again, I commend you for how you dealt with that. The biggest shock, like you said, that came from left field when your family just said, you know, this is it. That had to be hard. We experienced a lot of what was said tonight by Jason also, that we had the NAMI course that Larry had. We had the family to family. And it really wasn't until I went to a conference up in Albany and met two people that started to change my life for handling what I was dealing with. And that was the loss of my daughter. Wendy Birch from Albany and Matthew Shapiro. And they were instrumental in helping me cope. I do it every day, cope. I try to deal with it every day, and some days are more difficult than others. I experience the same things that Jason does, with the questions of why and guilt and what could I have done. And I think, Beth, you mentioned about putting something in words or making something visible does not necessarily put the thought in someone's mind. And trying to change that thought is very hard. They being the people that are considering suicide are very deceptive in their actions and what they do to the loved ones around them and try to hide what the ultimate goal is. And they're very good at that, because we couldn't believe that our daughter would commit suicide after multiple attempts that we were involved and witnessed. So as far as the gardens and the memorials, what my wife and I wanted to do after Nicole passed, we asked where she had worked for 10 years as a medical assistant if they would allow us to put her name on something and make a little memorial. And they graciously did. We put 2 stone benches, a tree, 2 plants, and a little plaque that said, Nicole Ettere will live in our hearts forever. Thank you to Caremount Medical for allowing the use of this property. So we joined a support group and found out that we wanted to, as we were talking to them, we wanted to realize that we wanted something a little bigger, a little broader, and a little more in somebody's face. We want this memorial to be in multiple locations, and we want people to see it. The general public, of course, but we want medical people to see this, health people to see this, administrative, anybody dealing in the mental health field, along with our politicians. All these people can change laws. If they see these memorials in so many places that they really start to think about mental illness, not just suicide, but we are advocating for suicide, that maybe someday the results of what we have could change. We call the 911, we call the hotlines, we actually call the mobile service 24/7. I finally got through after about 7 phone calls. And when I did, I got transferred to someone that said, please call me back on Monday. This phone call was made Friday afternoon. So, and you mentioned the timeline also of 4 years ago. That's when she died. That's when I think this started to become a little more public than it was then or before. So hopefully it will be more public to more people, and we could possibly change things. But that's my story. And again, if anyone has questions, they're welcome to ask. But as Larry and Jason said, it's a daily struggle. And what we found also in closing is that we all have a separate language, that we understand each other, and we don't have to explain what the condition of that day happens to be, whether it's good or bad, indifferent, however it is. They feel comfortable talking to me, and I feel comfortable talking to them. And thank you for the opportunity. As far as Nicole's law, I'm going to defer that to Matthew Shapiro. He gave birth to it. He's handling it where a major change came from COVID 2020, and it kind of got pushed a little off to the side. That is now being resurrected by Matthew. So thank you.
Thank you, Roy. And would you like to take a moment to share with us some information about Nicole and who Nicole was, so we can know a little bit about her as a person?
Well, she was very Italian. She was set in her ways. You could not convince her of anything. And I always tell the story that I remember giving her a quarter. And she said, what is this for? And I said to please call someone to get a ride home, because after the way you acted, I'm not driving you home. She developed into a very warm, caring medical assistant. She actually worked for disabled people, and she helped them with their daily activities. She was a soft, kind, warm-hearted person. And we had the warning signs. I guess she didn't express them enough to us. She suffered the last 8 months of her life from January of 2017 to September. Just completely spiraling downward, culminating in September on the 17th. On the 19th, they're so close, 17 and 19, and I always confuse them. we had her burial at a cemetery, and again wanted to make it more as a garden. I think she would have liked that too. She wasn't for formalities. She was very plain. She was very kind, and we miss her a whole lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your courage in sharing these stories. These are experiences that are unimaginable to most of us, and you're really helping us develop some empathy and understanding about the feelings around these experiences. One thing I know that you and I had talked about before when we touched base, Roy, was the feelings around this and not having any real expectations of yourself and your ability to move through grief, that your feelings are normal. They happen to you. There isn't a timeline that you have to stick to for overcoming the experiences of grief that you have. And I just wanted to honor that comment that you had made and share it with others because it is really so important in this experience. So thank you.
Just one comment regarding that. We learned that we could say no. If somebody invites you to a party and you just don't feel like being social and laughing and drinking and watching everybody else enjoying themselves, you could say no to that. You don't have to attend. You don't have to go to that wedding, no matter the relationship, how close. If you're feeling crappy that day, it's kind of okay to feel crappy. And you don't have to participate where it's uncomfortable. That's a strong part of it, where you're in a new life. It's not the same as the past life. You've entered a new realm, so to speak, and the rules are different. They're certainly different.
Mm.
Socially and every other way you interact with people at work, business, social, any ways that you deal, you have to do what gets you through the day, through the night, and the next day.
Thank you. Okay, so before we go into kind of a roundtable and taking questions, Matthew, would you like to share with us the information that you brought?
Sure. Thank you, Beth. And it's, to say humbling to be here really is not a strong enough word. I mean, Roy's very kind, says that I gave birth to Nicole's law, but that's really not true. Roy and his incredible wife, Lucille, did when they had the courage to testify about their experience in front of the Senate. And the next day, the senator's office, Senator Carlucci, called me and said, we need to create a Nicole's law. It had nothing to do with me. I take no credit for that. That's them and their incredible strength, and Larry and Jason. I mean, God, you know, hearing your stories and being able to talk about this, I mean, the strength that the two of you have is really humbling and honoring to be with you tonight. And of course, I thank everyone who's a part of this conversation watching. I think the topic, you know, one conversation can save a life is so true. And to Jason, Larry, and Roy, you know, I told, it was so interesting, you know, a few weeks ago when I was down in Putnam to dedicate the garden, and I'm going to show a news story about that if we still have some time. But Roy, we were showing each other pictures on our phone of sunsets and things like that. And Roy had showed me this moon that was so vividly red. I was like, I've never, that was the blood moon? He goes, no. That was it's the effects of the wildfires out west. We could see them out here. And I said, wow, it's really amazing with something so destructive to create something so beautiful. And then the next day I realized that was Roy and Lucille and all of you. You've taken something that's the most destructive thing that anything can happen to somebody, the loss of a loved one, or Larry, with all of your experiences, and you've turned it into something beautiful in the sense that you're using your pain to help others. And I'm so sorry that you all have to go through this and have had to walk this path, but I couldn't have any more respect for any of you for making sure that other people don't have to walk that same path as you did. So, like I say, it's very humbling to be with you guys. Thank God that my family has not been impacted by suicide, although 2 years ago I did lose an older half sibling, a brother who had years of substance use. I've had a younger brother who's had substance use issues. Thank God he's been in recovery. My mom has borderline personality disorder. She may have made 2 suicide attempts. I know we're not supposed to talk about the details, but it could have went either way. And that's, when Beth mentioned Nicole's law, that pertains not to just people who have made a suicide attempt, but what we're calling a self-inflicted life-threatening injury that could be a straight suicide attempt, a drug overdose, or an incident of self-harm, because sometimes it is hard, especially in a crisis situation, to differentiate between those acts. And what Nicole's law would do is, for people who've had multiple incidents of these self-inflicted life-threatening injuries, it would change the way their hospital stays are and hold hospitals more accountable to do better for those people than they did for Nicole. And, when talking to Roy and Lucille, I'd hear these horror stories that Nicole had made a suicide attempt. She'd be hospitalized for a couple of days, and then they would release her literally into the streets of Manhattan with paper slippers still on her feet. I mean, it's beyond inhumane. I mean, the family who was her caregiver and loved one wasn't notified that they can come get her and take her home, or help get her connected with services or anything. I mean, they just let her go with still looking like a patient. And we talk about stigmatizing. I mean, maybe in New York, it's not you. Some people don't bat in Manhattan. You see someone in a hospital gown walking the street. I don't know, but it's, these are social justice issues. They're humane issues, and no one should be treated like that. Again, is basically punished for being in pain and for having experiences like Larry did, and to be punished for that is just unthinkable. So we must do better. So, originally, like Roy had said, the original intent was that if we could document how many of these incidents had happened to the individual, like in Nicole's case, where she had several incidents in a 6-month span, that would, get the hospital to keep them longer until they were better stabilized. But as Roy said, the challenges of accessing hospital beds have always been great, but COVID certainly made that a lot more difficult. So the other things that Nicole's law would do that we're really focusing on more is trying to engage the families better. Have the families come in while the person before they're discharged, so we can discuss a recovery plan. And Jason, listening to you, and you did everything you could to keep Jason alive, and not just alive, but to keep him happy, to keep him well. And families need those tools. Not everyone is a Jason who's going to take it upon themselves or even knows where to go to find such an information. Even a NAMI class, we often say we're the best kept secret in town, but to make families more of the part of the recovery team and make them feel valued in their insights, and it also lets the person know that they have a support team and that they are loved. So that's number one. But most importantly, it would improve the discharge planning, and most importantly, there's a lot of things, but really the highlight of it is get them directly connected with services. I'm going to use a word that's a little controversial in our advocacy field, which is Pendra's law, or AOT, which is, asserted outpatient treatment. I'm not going to argue about that or not. Some people are for it, some people are against it. But one of the good things about AOT is that if you're given an order, even if it's placed on you involuntarily, you immediately go to the front of the line, so to speak. When there aren't enough services to go around, especially community-based services, once you get that order, you immediately go on the front of the line, whether it's for community services, housing services, things like that. So we want people who have been, sort of red flagged. That's also a negative word, but, that meet the criteria of Nicole's law. They wouldn't get an AOT order where it's forced treatment, but they would go to the front of the line to get the services. And that very, fragile period coming out of a hospital following a suicide attempt, those couple of weeks are a very vulnerable time. Anyone coming out of a hospital can be a very vulnerable time, integrating into the community and home, and some people do have shame and stigma from the hospitalization, but this will ensure that people will get those services needed as well. There'd also be, there've been a lot of studies that following a suicide attempt that's been seen in an emergency room, that very simple follow-up can go a long way. And when I mean very simple follow-up, I'm talking about sending a postcard or just a little card to say to the person, we're thinking about you, you can do this, you got this. You have support. So, those are some of the things that we want to do with Nicole's law. And it can really have a huge impact, we think, and help save lives, which is what we're trying to do. We're also, NAMI New York State's also working really hard on, when Beth Harrington was talking about some of the mobile crisis, and obviously she talked about the 273 talk, the suicide number, but we have this incredible opportunity coming down the pike in New York where this coming July 2022, we have to create a standardized 988 number, which is actually going to replace the 273 talk number, where, those can be hard to remember if you're in a crisis or your family member is a crisis. Looking at, well, first of all, I think, most of our cellular phones don't have the numbers and the letters right under it. We have to remember what number is T and what have you. So obviously people know 911, 988 is very similar. So it would be an easy to remember number. We're going to do a lot of educational efforts to really let people know that 988 is coming. And not only is this a replacement for 911, it's actually going to improve 911 for anyone in a mental health crisis, because we know that that is a very vulnerable time, and these are not going to be dispatchers on the phone like you would get at 911. It would be someone like Beth or the chaplain you mentioned, who started the Suicide Lifeline. God bless them. That these are trained professionals, and we want peers to be a part of this as well. That's a very important thing to state, that someone with a lived experience, if I was in that sort of state and got someone like Larry on the phone who understands where I am in that struggle, that can be tremendously beneficial to me. So we definitely want peers to be a part of that. And a lot of these situations hopefully would get diffused over the phone, or there would be a resolution over the phone where we wouldn't have to call in first responders or anything like that. But if first responders do have to be called, we don't want it to be police. I know Beth and NAMI Finger Lakes have been doing tremendous work. I know you brought in the leaders of Cahoots in Oregon to speak in the community, and that's what we're trying to replicate, to have a true mental health response to these issues. And we do know of a lot of people who have died by what they call death by suicide by cop, where in these type of situations that's the very tragic outcome, and that's exactly what we want to prevent. No one coming in a police uniform, no one having a gun, no one having something that could be triggering to the person in crisis. Again, we want it to be a peer to be a part of that response team who has a lived experience and that shared experience that's so important. And the final part of it, there's really 3 stages to a mental health crisis response, is having a better place to bring someone if they need to leave that situation they're in. In too many communities, the 2 options are either an emergency room or a police department. Neither one are appropriate to handle a mental health crisis, especially someone who could be suicidal. And you hear these horror stories where someone's brought into a hospital, they're suicidal, and they have to sit there for 72 hours until a bed becomes available. In that 72 hours, they decompensate more. They see traumatic things going on in the hospital, in the emergency room, and it doesn't help them at all. So what we're trying to expand and create are crisis stabilization centers that would not look like a hospital at all. That would be much more gentle, a non-medical approach, but a mental health response. Again, we want to see peers involved in that too. It's so important. And this is a place where somebody can stay for up to 24 hours while we figure out what's going on, what might have triggered them, how we can put tools in their toolbox that create a healthy resolution to this issue. And if they need to be connected to services, they would help connect them to services. That's always such a big key to this, because there's just not enough services available. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do. We're also, we're going to be putting out a big report on mental health crisis, which Beth is a part of our government affairs committee that's helped work on this report. That I think, if not next week, it'll be coming out the week after, before our education conference in the end of October, which I'll talk about in a second too. But I do want to touch on the memorial gardens and what we're trying to do there, because I think it's such an important initiative on several different levels. When I came down a couple of weeks ago and we dedicated, it was the day before. That night was going to start the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, which I explained is one of the 4 major Jewish holidays that have what we call a Yitzker connected to it, where we mourn our loved ones communally. And that's such a beautiful thing, where that you have the support of everyone who's there. Everyone's going through that same feelings of loss and remembrance and mourning. And so many people, the Jasons and the Roys of the world don't get that experience. We say all the time how mental illness can be very isolating. I mean, we heard it in Larry's story, how isolating his experience was from him. But especially for people who have lost a loved one to suicide, it can be very difficult. People don't know how to react, maybe reading in between the lines a little bit when Roy was talking about not wanting to go to celebrations. I think people who know what happened don't know what to say to you a lot of times. They feel bad. And I mean, Jay, I can see you nodding your head. People are very well intentioned, but it's a hard subject. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. And so creating a space for the families to have a communal public space for them to mourn and get the support and see the names of other people. When we launched the garden, or dedicated the garden 6 weeks ago in Putnam County, there were 6 names that are listed. We hope there'll be more. We hope more people die by suicide, of course, but people who maybe the families longer to come forward because of a lot of the self-inflicted shame or stigma, but to show them that there doesn't need to be shame or stigma. Your loved one was a person. They're not the name on a plaque. They were a person. They deserve to be loved, and they deserve to be remembered, and you deserve to know that you're not alone in this very horrific experience. So that's the first thing we really want the gardens to achieve, is create that safe space for families. But as Roy said, just as importantly, we're not just putting them in parks, we're putting them in very public places where important people come. I mean, the first one was at the Putnam County office, the office building for the county. So all the county leaders, including their medical directors and things like that, are going to pass the garden. It's right in the entryway. And this really, helps normalize this conversation and bringing it into everyday life. It's not something hidden in the corner anymore. It's out forward. It's a garden. It's you're going to pass this to get in the building, and it's such an important symbol and such a normalizing factor. I'm sorry, were you going to say something wrong?
No, I'm sorry. I cleared my throat and because I
Oh.
don't know how to mute.
Well, that's okay. And so I think it's just such an important initiative, and our goal is to get one in every county in New York. And I was going to show the video. It's only about 2 minutes, but I don't know if you have time. I can put it in the chat box if that's better.
Go ahead and share the video, Matthew. It's okay.
So this is from the news from that night.
Is paying tribute to those who have died by suicide in our region.
Yeah, News 12's Nadia Galindo shows us the memorial and what advocates are hoping to accomplish.
When I die, give what's left of me away.
Their loved one may have died alone.
And if you need to cry, cry for your brother.
But in death, the parents of Nicole Ettere have found a way to bring people together.
This beautiful garden was created in loving memory of all those in Putnam County who died by suicide.
Lucille and Roy Ettere spearheaded this first-of-its-kind garden of remembrance that recognizes lives lost to suicide. It now rests outside of the Putnam County office building in Carmel, conspicuously placed there for a reason.
It is a stigma.
Stigma attached to suicide stands as a barrier to people and families impacted by suicide.
This garden's purpose is to be a place of remembrance. It is also a powerful instrument of awareness that will hopefully generate much needed conversations about suicide prevention.
September marks Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. Advocates want to see the state do more on this issue. That's why they're encouraging state lawmakers to pass a bill next legislative session to create Nicole's Law. The bill, named after Nicole Ettere, would create a red flag system for those hospitalized after attempting suicide and connect them and their families with resources.
Mental health issues, substance use disorder issues are no different than diabetes and heart disease. The only difference is that society has given them a negative connotation.
The Etteres hope more remembrance gardens will be planted across the state.
Love doesn't die, people do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away.
They know all too well what's at stake. In Carmel, Nadia Galindo, News 12.
Now, if you or someone you know does need help, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That's at 800-273-8255.
So, I was very happy, whenever you see media, report on something in a responsible and way. And, I had worked with the reporter for a while before I let her come on, just to make sure she was coming at this from the right angle. And, we were very proud of the way it came out. Hopefully we'll start some conversations in Putnam. And like I said, there, we really hope we're not just dedicating a garden that day, but planting a seed that will continue to grow as we want to create these gardens all across the state. And the last thing I'm going to say is just, again, thank you to Larry and to Jason and to Roy for sharing yourselves in your pain to help others. And I've told this to Royce and Lucille several times, and Jason, I'll say it to you today, and hearing your story about Jason. And I know I was never lucky enough to meet Nicole or Jason, but in hearing how you speak of them, hearing how you honor them, I feel like I do know them, especially, Nicole, working so much with Roy and Lucille, that you talking about them and you sharing their story, you're keeping their legacy alive, and that's so important. And when I gave the remarks at the garden, I kind of ended by doing a prayer that is said during Yisker about remembrance, and I just want to give you the last line of that, because I think it's so important to what we're trying to do today, and that's as long as we live, they will live too, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. And as we do events like this, I really feel like Nicole is a part of me, Jason is a part of me, as we fight to make sure that other people don't have to walk down the road, that Nicole and Jason are a part of that fight too. So thank you for giving them that opportunity and making sure that their legacy lives on. And again, the three of you, and Beth too, for your work doing it, just thank you. And it's really humbling to be here with you.
Thank you so much. That was a really great and thorough presentation on all of the ways that NAMI is supporting um, changes in crisis services and helping our loved ones. I want to open the conversation up with all of our guests, including Beth. I wanted to mention one thing that we've talked about before, in that the challenges of the 988 implementation with the current system, 911 system. And it may be complicated to try to interact with the 911 system. And if people are going to call 911 and have those dispatchers who only have a very limited amount of time to kind of suss out what the needs are of the person that are calling, how complicated that could be. Beth, could you elaborate on that a little bit, because you have so long a history, experience with emergency response systems as well?
Yeah, excuse me. I think we're talking about the infrastructure as well as the interaction between 911 and 988. A typical 911 call, the dispatcher has about 90 seconds or a minute and a half to solicit critical information from the caller and then make a decision as to what resources are going to be deployed. The average call to our crisis line is about 20 minutes. So you can see that huge discrepancy in how information is taken in. I will say locally, we're working really closely with 911 and a couple other county agencies to see how we can make this interface happen. And we're also lucky that we're undergoing that, they're calling it reimagining law enforcement or mental health responses. So hopefully we're able to take those needs into account too as we're working through this system. But it really is an infrastructure system. We're also working with subcommittees of the state, who's then providing information from a state level to Vibrant, the organization that's kind of coordinating this for the federal government. It's a huge, huge undertaking. If we look back to the history of 911, most people estimate that it took 10 years before that system was really functioning the way it should be. So we're trying to accomplish a huge undertaking in a very short period of time. So I'm sure there'll be glitches here and there.
Sure. It's a huge undertaking, especially because we kind of think we have an infrastructure in place now that's pretty effective, but there are so many challenges, and thus the inspiration behind having a dedicated crisis response number. So thank you for that. I also wanted to touch a little bit on how to make a crisis call where there's imminent danger, or if you have a loved one who's in crisis and might potentially injure themselves. In Tompkins County, it's important now, if you have to call 911, it could be very helpful for you to mention that you think that your loved one is having a mental health crisis when you call 911. And also now you can ask for a CIT trained officer. We just now, most recently in the last week or so, we now have CIT trained officers in Tompkins County in various law enforcement agencies. And so this is a specific type of training that helps officers understand the mental health needs and de-escalation techniques of people who are in crisis. NAMI as a national organization and NAMI locally, the Finger Lakes and New York State levels, we are strong advocates for CIT training. So we're really grateful that the county has undertaken that. All right. I wonder if we could go around, and maybe if there's anyone who would be interested in sharing, what are some of the things that you found most supportive through your experience? whether it's, I know we've heard from Roy talking about meeting with Wendy and Matthew and advocacy efforts and those ways to help us work through our experiences with suicide. Wondering, Larry, if you would be willing to share, or Jason, or anyone, something that's been helpful to you.
I think the turning point for me was when the psychiatrist told me that I had mental illness diagnoses, but more importantly, that we're going to need to be treated, and that I had a right to be treated and to be cared for. But the biggest thing about that conversation was my right to advocacy and my right to justice. And that really began my search for justice and my search for care, long-term care.
Thank you. That's really important, having our feelings validated and our experiences validated. I think that begins with us as a community and as a society valuing everyone's experiences and valuing the commitment that it takes from a community to invest in proper care, effective care, and also all of the needs that someone might have, whether it be housing or medical care, or access to support and education, with regard to what they have available to them, and actually having access to it. So that's really an important point. Thank you, Larry.
And for me, I felt a lot of support from my friends and the community. I really felt like they buoyed me through the immediate aftermath. And then the organizations that I mentioned before were really critical for me. NAMI, the Ettere Suicide Prevention and Crisis Line, and Hospice Care.
Thank you, Jason.
I think I owe Larry and Jason an apology, because somewhere along the line, I said we all know how each other feels when we come to this garden, because we've all lost someone. I'm not singling out Larry that he didn't lose someone, or Jason the way he lost someone, but I have never lost a spouse. And I can't imagine what Jason may feel like, where I said I did. It's a totally different experience. It's just on a different level. And Larry, I apologize to you, because I can't imagine what you had to go through in your own mind. That had to be a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day a week, constant switch turned on all of that time. And that I cannot imagine. And again, I apologize to both of you for just generalizing. Sure, I know how you feel. I don't.
Thank you,
No
Larry.
apology necessary, but thank you very much for saying that to me.
Okay,
I agree as well.
Thank you, Jason.
I actually have a question about the garden. Is it our hope that we'll have an opportunity to have these gardens, like if NAMI Finger Lakes would like to put one together, or our local suicide prevention and crisis services? What types of places, where would you suggest we look to place a garden like this, that so many people could see it?
Generally, in every county in Westchester County, in New York State, we also want to signal in on maybe towns. It's not limited to anything. It could be in Ulster County in 4 locations, and maybe another county in 1 location. That's, I want to have it in as many places in New York State and beyond By that, I mean other states. I want it to be recognized that it may be something that opens people's eyes to either advocate for themselves, to go to the proper health services, and just to know that there is an open line in the mental health industry because of so much awareness, and as much the mental health people to also be very involved with it, as well as government and politicians. County parks, towns, parks, private properties, building lobbies. We also were in contact with, unfortunately, a funeral parlor that we wanted to have funds raised through the funeral parlor to let them know that there are agencies they can donate to make them aware, the way we're being made aware of suicide, of mental health, of many mental health disorders. But to answer your question, yes, in as many places as we can.
And our goal, like Roy said, is to put them in very public places. We want them to be seen. We want them to be seen by decision makers. So again, having them in county legislative buildings or county office buildings. Here in Albany, I would love to. Goal is either get one near the Capitol or near the OMH office on Holland Avenue. Where people are reminded why they're doing what they're doing, and although a lot of people there don't need the reminder they've been impacted by this, but the key is we want them in very public places that they'll be seen and really start conversations. And even if they don't start conversations, if someone stumbles upon it, it changes the way they think about suicide or view people that died by suicide, then, if we've changed one heart and one mind, we've made it a better place. And that's certainly the goal of this.
Matthew, thank you. That could be the vehicle to start up a conversation with two people that noticing it together. Thank you.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And these are places where, we've talked tonight about the importance of having these support services, and the crisis response can only be sustainable if the new crisis response can only be sustainable if we have those services developed that can help support it. So when someone goes to a crisis stabilization center, we've made the investment in all of the other services that can help that person that they might receive once they go to a crisis stabilization center or call the 988 number and get attention for the crisis that they're in. So, and that's one of and that's a big problem, because as we know, Roy, in your experience, we can say, we want people to reach out and get the services and the help that they need. But your points about mental health care and the times that Nicole had been discharged without any real positive plan in place, without much follow-up, and those experiences that made things very challenging for her and for your family to help her and support her. That's important to note, for sure.
She had been discharged from one hospital, and the discharge plan was to join a group of therapists and advocates. And there was a problem that it couldn't happen for 10 days. And we said, what are we supposed to do for those 10 days to help her? And I think we were told to read a book. And we were livid. So there were a few situations like that I won't go into, for concerns over time.
Thank you. And wait times after a discharge to get to see a psychiatrist in our area, it's very challenging. There tends to be a lack of people going into or in the psychiatry field. So, or prescribers, that's another very challenging thing. So while someone could be discharged from a hospital with maybe a 30-day prescription, they may run out before they're able to see someone else. And that time, once they're discharged, between discharge and seeing someone to follow up and kind of follow up with that plan, it's critical. And yet it's so long. And oftentimes our loved ones don't have insight to their illness. And when they leave the hospital, maybe they've been on medication in the hospital and they might have gained a little bit of insight. And so in that period of time, we could lose them. I mean, we can lose their attention for getting and following up on critical mental health care. So definitely the investment in our mental health system is critical at this time. And before we close, I would also like to just take a brief moment of silence and just give some time to our loved ones who we've lost, and the people who experience despair, and people who have overcome that, people who might be experiencing it right now and don't know where to turn. So if we could just have just a brief moment of silence for them and for ourselves. Thank you.
May I ask Jason a question?
Sure. Jason, is that
Sure.
okay with you?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Jason. Were there warning signs prior to the act that were there, but deep down you thought, oh, it could never happen?
Well, I think there were probably warning signs that it was a potential, but there were no warning signs that anything was imminent. And we did have conversations about suicide, and we did talk about it. And I did ask him, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And depending on the day, I would get different responses. And I did have a conversation with him, and I asked him if he ever got to the point where he really thought he was going to harm himself, if he could talk to me first. And I begged him, basically, don't make me find you, talk to me first. And unfortunately, he didn't do that. And he didn't tell anyone his plans. And I think most likely because at that point he had made up his mind and didn't want to be talked out of it.
With our daughter, it was similar. The seed was planted, and it just wasn't going to go the other way. It was going to go the way they planned.
Jason, I think you made a really good point, and I'm glad that you feel this way, is that you don't feel guilty. And I think so many times that not only is the pain there, but then they carry guilt around, like, if I, what if, should I? And that in itself is often very destructive. So I'm so glad that you could say that you don't feel guilty and that you were able to give him whatever support he needed while he was still here. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. And I have a lot of empathy and compassion for what he was going through and dealing with. And obviously I wish he would have chosen a different route, held on longer. But at the same time, if I was going through everything that he went through, I don't know. I don't know if I would have done anything differently. And so I have, you know, I don't have a lot of anger towards him. I have a lot of compassion and empathy for how much he was suffering. And I know he didn't want to leave me. And you know, I say that the act itself was horrific, but everything else surrounding it was, his love for me was very evident, and I'm appreciative of that fact, at least.
Jason, we belong to a support group, and we were given an analogy that the patient is holding his hand over a candle, and everybody is saying, please hang on, wait for the next medication, wait for the next doctor. Meanwhile, the candle's not moving and things are happening, and I won't go into graphics, but that's the type of pain that they could possibly have been in. And there wasn't a thing in the world, a person in the world, or a medication in the world that would have changed that or altered that. That's the state of mind they were in. And Jason did not. That's just the state of mind they were in at that time. Jason was not Jason when the act was committed.
That's right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wonder if we could go around, if there are any final thoughts any of you would like to share with us this evening before we close.
I'll just say that I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk about my experience and to talk about my Jason, and meeting those of you on the panel. It's been a really good experience, and I wish strength for all of us to continue on.
Just a lot of gratitude, you know, to all of you for being so strong, and Beth for what you do every day to make your community better. And you know, it's an honor to fight alongside of you, like I said, to make, you know, the world a better place, and so others don't have to experience what you have. So just a lot of gratitude, and I'm very humble hearing all of you, and very grateful for all of you. So thank you. You know, one thing I did forget to say, not to throw in a plug, we do have our education conference coming up. I put my email in the thing. We do have several workshops on suicide, on crisis. One of the ones, you know, the difference between recognizing self-harm versus suicide attempt, which I think is a very important discussion to have. So if anyone wants more information, they can find me at matthew@NAMINYS.org. And Beth M., thank you so much for putting this incredible panel together and inviting me to be a part of it.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew, for all of the advocacy efforts you teach us, and the methods that you teach us through NAMI New York State and our Government Affairs Committee. And anyone who's interested in advocating with NAMI on any of these topics, to move Nicole's law or to help inspire our local policymakers to support the 988 implementation and the services that are needed to support it, please be in touch at NAMIFingerLakes.org, or help@NAMIFingerLakes.org is another way to reach us. So anyone else, final thoughts?
Just thank you to everyone also. Again, I was humbled and honored to be part of this panel. I'm so glad Matthew is Matthew. He's been a great help, a great help. And thank you all. And enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you.
I have great gratitude for joining all of you and meeting all of you. This is my first experience presenting in any type of a forum. And I really got a lot out of it, although we're all coming from different places. And I plan on following the 988 progression, and going to be spending some time on the NAMI website to learn more about you. I know my organization is learning more and more about you every day. So some opportunities for partnership might be there. So thank you, Beth.
Yeah, and definitely reach out.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Larry. And yes, our local mental health association is a fantastic advocacy organization for people living with mental health conditions in our community. And yes, we look forward to many opportunities to collaborate and helping our community together. One thing I do want to mention on that note is Mental Health Association is very active in helping people create a WRAP plan, and a wellness recovery action plan can really help a person who is experiencing a need for having a plan in place so their voice can be heard when they're in crisis, so they can take ownership and be empowered to make choices to help their loved ones and remind themselves of what they need and what they want when they're experiencing crisis. So, and also if your loved one is not cooperative and does not want to do a WRAP plan, as a family member, it's advised that you can do a WRAP plan so you can have a sense of what, first of all, what you need for your own wellness, but also what you need for your own wellness around your loved one's mental illness and potential crises. So highly recommend getting in touch with them. They provide instruction on how to create a WRAP plan fairly frequently. And it's something that I highly recommend. So
Yes, they run both a youth group to do WRAPs as well as an adult support group that's doing WRAPs. So yes, I second everything you said about that resource.
We're also in the jail doing WRAP, and we're also in day reporting through probation doing WRAP. I assist in teaching it. And so Beth, thank you, and both Beths, thank you for that shout out. We appreciate it.
Sure thing. And for all the work you're doing there, it's in the peer advocacy program. It's very important. So thank you. We could probably share support and ideas for supporting for a much longer time this evening, but I really want to respect your time and just express my gratitude for your courage and willingness to share with us again. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight and thank everyone for attending.
Thank you, Beth.
Thanks.